In all my years on the bench in Providence, I've witnessed every kind of case, from reckless drivers to those simply trying to escape the mundane of their everyday lives. But there are cases that stand out, the ones that hit you deep in your heart, the ones you carry with you long after you've left the courthouse. They're never the loud ones, they're the quiet ones, the ones that don't make headlines but speak to something much deeper in the human experience. One such case happened on a typical Tuesday morning. The courtroom was filled with the usual traffic violations, people in a rush, others distracted by their phones, and a few who believed the yellow light meant speed up. The air was thick with impatience. The sounds of shuffling papers, a ticking clock, and faint murmurs filled the room as people anxiously awaited their turn. Then the clerk called the name Victor Coella. A hush fell over the room. The man who stood up didn't look like a typical defendant. He looked like someone who had seen history itself, a 96-year-old man. His body, frail and shaky, rose from the wooden bench with the help of his aluminum cane. His suit, though immaculate, was decades old. It wasn't just any suit, it was a suit meant for weddings, funerals, or apparently, municipal court. As he made his way to the podium, each step was slow and deliberate. His shoulders were stooped, carrying the weight of nearly a century of living, and yet he moved with a quiet dignity that commanded respect. The courtroom was absolutely silent. Even the shuffling of papers had ceased. All that could be heard was the rhythmic tapping of his cane against the wooden floor. It took him what felt like an eternity to cross those 20 feet. I watched him carefully, noticing the tremble in his hands, the careful way he gripped his cane. I knew right away that this wasn't going to be a straightforward case. The charge was simple: speeding in a school zone. On paper, a typical traffic violation. But as soon as Victor reached the podium and looked up at me, I could see it in his eyes. Something deeper, something much more profound than the paperwork suggested. There was a story here, and it wasn't written on the file in front of me. "Mr. Coella," I said softly, "you are charged with speeding in a school zone. Can you tell me what happened?" His hands tightened around the cane as if summoning the strength to speak. His voice was weak and cracked, barely above a whisper. "I don't drive fast, Judge," he said. "I'm 96 years old, and I drive slowly. I only drive when I have to." I waited. I knew there was more to this than just a simple violation. Silence has a way of drawing out the truth, and so I let him speak in his own time. He looked down at his worn shoes, gathering the last bit of his courage, before looking up at me again. "I was going to the doctor," Victor continued. "I had to take my boy for his blood work." "Your boy?" I asked, confused. I assumed he meant a grandson or perhaps a great-grandson. It wasn't uncommon for elderly people to step in and care for younger generations, especially when parents were unable to do so. "But then," Victor corrected me, and in that moment, the weight of his words crashed down on me like an avalanche. "My son," he said, his voice breaking. "He's 63 years old, and he's handicapped." The courtroom was frozen. The air felt heavy. A 96-year-old man, still taking care of a 63-year-old son, was standing before me, fighting the effects of age and time to provide the care his son needed. The room, once restless with impatience, was now completely still. Everyone in the gallery was silent, their eyes wide as they absorbed the depth of his sacrifice. If you've ever watched your parents grow old, if you've ever seen a loved one struggle with aging, you'll understand the profound respect I felt for this man in front of me. To be 96 years old and still responsible for the care of another, it's a level of devotion that is difficult to comprehend. Victor, despite his frailty, was still the primary caregiver for his son. Every day he woke up, fed him, drove him to appointments, and carried the burden of responsibility that no father should ever have to bear at that age. I looked at the paperwork again. It was just a speeding ticket, but the story behind it was so much more. A machine had issued the ticket. A camera had captured his car speeding in a school zone. But machines don't know the whole story. They don't know the sacrifices, the exhaustion, and the love that come with caring for a family member day after day. "Every 2 weeks," Victor said, his voice trembling, "I take him for blood work. I drive him because he can't go alone. I'm the only one who can take care of him." At that moment, I realized the true weight of his life. The law was a rigid instrument designed to measure speed and impose fines. But no law could measure the depth of a father's love. It couldn't account for the decades of selfless caregiving, the endless sacrifice, and the exhaustion of a man who had never stopped taking care of his child, even when that child was an adult. I looked up at Victor, my heart heavy with respect for the life he had led. "Victor," I said, "you are a good man, a truly good man." He blinked, surprised. For a lifetime, he had worked tirelessly without expecting recognition. He had done the hard work of caregiving, not for applause, but out of love. And yet, here I was, acknowledging his devotion in front of an entire courtroom. I looked around the room. The prosecutor, who had been so quick to prosecute others, now looked down in reflection. The bailiff, who had witnessed thousands of cases, stood with his head slightly bowed. The people in the gallery who had come in to contest their own minor offenses were now deeply moved by the story unfolding before them. "This is not just about a traffic violation," I said, leaning forward. "This is about a man who has given everything for his family, a man who has lived a life of sacrifice, and at 96 years old, he is still carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders." I turned to Victor, my voice soft but firm. "I'm dismissing this ticket," I announced. "You do not owe the city a dime. You have already paid your debt to society with a lifetime of unconditional love and devotion." Victor's eyes widened. He had come into the courtroom expecting to pay a fine, perhaps to face a penalty that would add another burden to his already overloaded shoulders. But instead he was being seen, not as a defendant, but as a hero. He stood there trembling, his face streaked with tears. He didn't cheer, he didn't clap. He simply stood, holding his cane, weeping with a relief so profound it was almost palpable. The weight of the injustice he had expected to face was lifted, and in that moment his tears were not just of sorrow, but of gratitude. I looked at him one last time. "Victor," I said, "you are a remarkable man, but tell me, who takes care of you?" He paused, looking at me with a confusion that spoke volumes. "Nobody," he replied softly. "I just take care of him." Those words hit me like a ton of bricks. A 96-year-old man who had spent his entire life caring for others had no one to care for him in his final years. He was alone in his devotion, without the support he so desperately needed. As I watched him leave the courtroom that day, I realized that this case wasn't just about a traffic violation. It was about something much more profound, the quiet, invisible heroism of people like Victor Coella, who give everything for the ones they love, and who never ask for anything in return. And as the video of our interaction went viral, people from around the world reached out, offering to help this elderly man. It wasn't just about a ticket being dismissed. It was about the universal recognition of love, sacrifice, and the human connection that binds us all. People wanted to help, to show their gratitude for the quiet heroes who do the heavy lifting of life without expecting praise. Victor's story touched the hearts of millions because, deep down, we all long for a world that sees the unsung heroes. We want to live in a world that values kindness, compassion, and love above all else. And in that courtroom on that Tuesday morning, Victor Coella showed us all what true heroism looks like. If you've ever cared for a loved one, if you've ever carried the weight of responsibility on your shoulders, then you know that sometimes the greatest act of justice is simply recognizing the sacrifice. Victor, your story will never be forgotten. You are the true hero of this world.